Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Science and Wisdom of Emotion Summit. In this panel, we're going to delve into the intricacies of what's called social emotional learning, or SEL. It's bringing to kids in school the training and elements of what it means to be intelligent about emotions, being self-aware, being able to manage your own emotions well, being able to tune into other people, to empathize, and putting that all together to harmonize, to be socially skilled, to say what you need to say, but say it in a way where people can hear you, to cooperate, to be a good team player, all of that. And we're going to cover a range of aspects of this, starting with the developmental needs of kids during the school years, and then going into the question of, well, you know, does SEL, do these programs really make a difference for kids? Do they work? And what are the elements of the best programs and implementation? And also, you know, does it speak to the real issues of the day, things like equity and so on? And then we're going to look at the future of SEL, or what I think may be the future, and examine whether adding mindfulness or mind training or the cultivation of empathy and compassion could even make these programs even more robust in how they matter for kids' lives. And I'd like to introduce the panelists. First, Mark Greenberg, who was the chair of prevention research at Penn State University. He was founding director of that program and a professor of human development and psychology. But I just heard that Mark is now living near the border of Canada, north of Seattle. Mark, are you still connected with Penn State?
Retired but emeritus.
Thank you. Okay. And I first met Mark when I was writing the book Emotional Intelligence, and I was looking around for any programs that did this, you know, helped with kids' emotional literacy in schools. And I came upon the PATHS program, P-A-T-H-S, caps, all caps, which Mark was a co-founder of and a director of, and which is still robust and going strong. And so a model program. Then I'm going to turn to Rob Jagers. Am I saying your name right, Rob Jagers?
Jagers.
Rob Jagers, who's the Vice President of Research at CASEL, which is a collaborative for academic, social, and emotional learning. And CASEL was founded by Mark and I and a group of another handful of people 25 years ago or so. And one of the things it does, which Rob is really leading, is make sure that there is first-rate research done on these programs, both to be sure that we're on the right track, but also I see it as ammunition for school districts, for parents, for boards of education in seeing that, you know, maybe we can offer this to our kids too, if they don't already. And Rob was a founding director of the Pathways program, which was helping underprivileged students or students who weren't getting into universities from groups that weren't, get in more easily, diversify student bodies. And that's equity has been a real concern of his too all along. And so we'll hear from him about the research, how to best implement these programs, and maybe a little bit about the social issues it might address. And then finally, there's Patricia Jennings, who everybody calls Tish. Tish Jennings has been a leader in bringing contemplative practice into SEL programs, mindfulness, which I see as training the mind for kids, and also cultivating empathy and compassion. And we'll hear from her about how these programs are going. I see it as SEL 2.0, as a part of the future as these programs evolve. So without any further ado, let's turn to Mark. And Mark, if you could fill us in on the developmental needs of kids and also how SEL might speak to that.
Sure, thanks, Dan. Really what we're focused on here, I think, is how we educate the heart, but also how we create a sense of belonging and systems change for everyone in our communities. I think I'll start by giving a definition of SEL. Just briefly, SEL is the process through which all people, young people and adults, We acquire social and emotional competencies, which include some knowledge, some skills, and of course, attitudes in addition. And we talk about 5 kinds of competencies in the CASEL model that are across all ages, doesn't matter what age we are. There are interpersonal skills like social awareness and relationship skills. Really, it's about making and getting along with friends, because we know that people that make friends and can get along and negotiate with their friends are going to do pretty well. And then there are intrapersonal skills, our own awareness and our ability to manage our emotions. And then lastly, responsible decision-making. So what's the goal of SEL? It's really to empower children to flourish in both their relationships and in their identity, and of course in their learning. We know that effective curriculum have a number of characteristics. First, they focus on helping children learn to regulate their emotions so they can be really empowered to use their thinking skills to solve problems. And by regulating emotions, I don't mean that we want to invalidate any emotions. In fact, for children, the important thing is to have them express all of their emotions and understand that all emotions are expressible. But we do want to decrease the recovery period, as Paul Ekman would say, from emotional arousal, be it anger or jealousy or excitement, so they can really use their thinking skills to solve their problems. Or as what you called, Dan, many years ago, they're not emotionally hijacked. Second, the second thing I think that good SEL programs do is they increase awareness of emotional states in others. It's really the beginning of empathy and compassion. And to do this in a multicultural society, it means we need to make sure that SEL programs intentionally embrace diversity and teach the issue of interdependence is so key. And that's really one of the great contributions of His Holiness to this work, is talking about and bringing in this issue of interdependence. The third characteristic, I think, is learning to have frank conversations about feelings as a way of understanding others and solving interpersonal difficulties, and maybe also systemic issues, which we're all facing right now. Fourth is an important skill, planning and thinking ahead so that one can avoid problems or solve difficult problems that you're in by really thinking through the situation. Sometimes we might think about that as systems thinking. Fifth is developing a healthy sense of identity. And I think I'll say a bit more about that, but Rob will also probably follow up. And sixth is, especially as children get older, helping them to develop a sense of purpose. This issue of having a sense of purpose is very important here. And so quality SEL does this by deeply engaging youth when it's well done and giving them a voice in the process. But this is a long developmental process. So how can we think about the different developmental periods of childhood? Well, of course, this begins in infancy with the development of healthy and trusting attachments. There's very good research now for over 30 years showing that when parents recognize their infants' negative emotions, for example, their anger and their sadness, and they help them to cope with these emotions, children over time develop better physiological regulation of their emotions, and they show more positive behavior. So a critical issue here is early in development is the quality of attachments, and that relationships in infancy, they don't determine, but they begin to set the course for later social emotional development. The amount of positive emotions, not just negative emotions, positive emotions like joy in the relationship in infancy is critical for setting what we think of as brain pathways. We know that each developmental period matters for emotional development, but we really need to begin at the beginning. And in short, making babies happy grows a circuitry that helps them to have positive feelings like joy throughout their lives. Now, you remember the book, Everything I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten, and that there's a great truth in what Robert Fulghum said there, is that there's this incredible and dramatic growth in both language, executive function, and emotional awareness in the preschool and early school years. Children just show so much growth in emotional awareness during this period. You know, in the early phases when they're toddlers or just 2.5 years old, they have very few words for emotions. But in the preschool years, there's a dramatic growth in children's ability to talk about emotions and to recognize them. And we know that if we facilitate social emotional learning in that preschool period, that the ability to recognize and manage emotions can dramatically increase. And last, this is when children begin to plan and think ahead for the first time. They begin to be able to take one person's perspective at a time other than their own. And so we can ask a 4 or 5-year-old questions about what they could do when teased by another child, and they can begin to do this interpersonal problem solving that we struggle with, of course, and work on our whole lives. And we've shown in a study that tracked children from age 6 to 26 that teachers' ratings when children entered kindergarten of their ability to make friends and regulate their emotions, these two critical skills, making friends and regulating emotions, predicted, even after we controlled for the child's IQ, their behavior problems, their ethnicity, their gender, the quality of the neighborhood they lived in, all those things were already accounted for, that these two skills of making friends and managing our emotions predicted if they would graduate from high school, if they would graduate from college, their criminal history record by age 25, whether they would live in public housing, all kinds of different characteristics. And this is true above and beyond academic abilities. Now, adolescence is a really critical period, and Rob may say more about this, but in adolescence, the issues of identity and sense of purpose become terribly important. And as adolescents begin to see themselves not only in their relationship with others, but their place in the world, the ability to see oneself and others and yet see one's unique identity are both critically important developments, and really creates, I think, the possibility for developing both spiritual concerns and social action at the same time, things that His Holiness always talk about together, that the spiritual concerns of children, adults, and their social actions should be thought of as not one thing, but as two parallel but interacting forces. Now, His Holiness said to me once in a meeting, he said to me that it's important that we not only focus on negative emotions and how to manage them, but also on positive emotions. And in the heat of the moment, of course, working with negative emotions is important. But he said to me that the perpetual exposure of children to an atmosphere of genuine love and compassion, both within the family, by parents, and by teachers in schools, who have a genuine concern and a real care for the well-being of children, will be significant, probably the most significant single factor that influences children's social emotional development. He said to me in these words, "It's very difficult to try to teach the value and importance of compassion and love to children through words. Actions speak louder than words." And so when we think about social emotional learning, it's not just teaching children didactically, but it's also what we do. It's how we embody these social emotional skills in our everyday small interactions with children and teens that makes a difference. Now, I've talked about early childhood and adolescence, but I think we need to address adults. As one superintendent said to me years ago, he said, "The problem in my district is not the children, it's us." And only very recently, in the last 10 or 15 years, but it really began with the meeting Destructive Emotions in 2000 in Dharamsala, has there been beginning to be a focus on adults and SEL. The well-being and social emotional competence of teachers has finally become a focus. And I know Tish will elaborate this more, but if we're to effectively support the developmental skills, the competencies, and the attitudes of students, we need to focus on both the well-being and the needs of teachers.
Mark, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I want to circle back to something you said in passing, which is the relationship between SEL and social activism. Are you saying that one necessarily leads to the other, or is there a certain kind of learning or experience that is more likely to make a child, either in adolescence or adulthood, actually act on their principles?
Well, I think the more that we help them in childhood to act on their principles by doing, by giving them the voice and empowering them to take actions, even small actions in their schools and in their communities, and have them feel that fairness and justice are a critical part of the systemic changes we need to make. I think as we empower them to do that, these things interact together. The more we are aware of ourselves and others, the more we develop a sense of interdependence and compassion, but also righteous anger. And we learn to act on that anger in ways that are effective. We see that the issues of social emotional learning and social justice become interactive.
Say a little more about righteous anger. How can anger be constructive?
Well, that goes back, Dan, to the meeting in 2000 in Destructive Emotions. And it's interesting because the title of the meeting was Destructive Emotions. But during that meeting, we all agreed, East and West, that emotions themselves are never destructive. Emotions are just what they are. It's what we do. It's how we manage them that's important. And that anger can be a very destructive emotion, but righteous anger that's sees injustice and then uses effective decision-making to resolve or to focus on how to change the situation. It may be something in a system. It may be just something that's personal to us. But if our anger is righteous, it's about injustice and unfairness, and we're able to use that anger, harness it effectively. Well, we can see that in many movements in our history, including what's going on right now with systemic racism.
I'm reminded of something, since you brought him up, the Dalai Lama said about making anger constructive. He said, keep the focus, keep the passion, keep the persistence, keep the energy, but drop the hatred. Then he said, you can be more strategic, which I think equates to what you're saying, making better decisions.
Exactly.
Tish or Rob, do you have any questions for Mark?
No, not at this time.
Well, then I think I will say over to you. You're on.
Well, I wanted to offer a bit about the evidence that of the effectiveness of social and emotional learning programs. As the Vice President of Research at CASEL, I'm responsible for helping to advance the science of social and emotional learning, meaning that we are very much interested in what works for whom under what circumstances. That's the really the kind of underlying motivation for a lot of our ongoing work. Social and emotional learning, to your earlier point, Dan, about the foundation of CASEL, et cetera. CASEL has been an organization since 1995, and the field has grown tremendously. And I think part of its, the uptake of social emotional learning was associated with the systematic work that folks like Mark and others have done over time, Tish as well, sorry for not including you initially, Tish, but the systematic work, the studies that have been done. And so in 2011, there was a meta-analysis that I think was pivotal to the growth of the field and the uptake of the work more broadly. And in that meta-analysis, right, a study of studies, right? And these are well-designed studies that include control groups, meaning some young people got social emotional learning programs, others did not receive it, and we were able to compare the relative impacts or outcomes for those young people. So 213 well-designed studies were looked at in this meta-analysis in 2011. That's over 270,000 students from kindergarten through 12th grade. And what the findings included that social emotional learning programs, those students receiving social emotional learning outcomes compared to their peers who did not, had reduced conduct problems. That's acting out misbehaviors, school-based misbehaviors. So a reduction in a lower level of conduct problems and also lower levels of emotional distress for those students. At the same time, the students receiving social emotional learning programs had increases in attitudes about themselves and others and about school, more pro-social or positive classroom behavior. And I think importantly for many people who work in schools, there was a 11% increase on standardized achievement test scores. And so you not only had the social and emotional growth and development in positive directions, but also academic growth associated with social and emotional learning programs. Now, these programs, these kinds of impacts were associated, were more heightened in situations where the programs are well implemented. Well implemented here is, we use the acronym SAFE to describe well implemented programs. The programs are structured, that's the S, and meaning they have a scope and a sequence. They're active, to Mark's point, they give young people and adults opportunities to practice the skills, the knowledge, etc. They're focused, they're very intentional about what it is they're actually trying to impart in the teaching and learning process. And they're also explicit, meaning that what is being taught is affirmed and made clear to both the young people and adults. So those types of programs produce those kinds of positive impacts. Now in 2017, there was another meta-analysis that really looked at the long-term impacts of being involved in the kinds of programs that I was just describing. The study, again, looked at a number of well-implemented studies which followed young people over time from 6 months to 18 years in terms of follow-up. And the general findings were, again, lower conduct problems, lower emotional distress, lower drug use, while also producing more positive attitudes towards self and others, more pro-social behavior, as well as improved academic performance. So you could see both more immediate positive impacts as well as longer term positive impacts from exposure to well-implemented social emotional learning programs. So a word about, issues of equity and excellence, which have, more recently, as part of CASEL's ongoing work, we periodically look at the literature, think about what's present, what's missing, how to continue to evolve our understanding of what works for whom under what circumstances. And so in 2017, we began the process of reviewing the literature and revising and subsequently revising our definition of SEL to make it more inclusive and to be more explicit about the possibilities that SEL presents for a broader range of young people. Now this, anticipated some of the more recent issues of inequity, et cetera, that are manifest both in the pandemic as well as the various forms of civil unrest, right? So our work, I think, is attempting to speak to some of those issues prior to, during, and beyond the current circumstances we're facing. So our definitions of social emotional learning competencies now are more explicit about the development of a healthy identity, the need for personal and collective agency, feeling and fostering a sense of belonging within and across difference, engaging in collaborative problem solving, and cultivating an abiding sense of curiosity. And so being more explicit about these issues, in many ways, is an attempt to open up our understanding to a broader range of young people and adults who, some of whom have experienced historical marginalization and disenfranchisement that you see people responding to today. And so then the question becomes, how do we then, from a programmatic perspective, begin to address some of these issues both in children, adolescents, and adults. And long story short, we want to attend more closely to what occurs in families. Mark alluded to this earlier in his discussion of attachment for younger children, but families continue to play an important role in the lives of young people. And the connection between families and young people's development over time, and schools, where young people have to be for a substantial period of their day, but also of their lives, and the connection with community all become important. So in trying to address issues of equity and excellence, we are paying much more attention now to family, school, community partnerships. That meaning we're trying to better understand how learning of social and emotional and academic competency, how the growth of academic, social, and emotional competencies occurs across those contexts, and also trying to bring some cohesion to how the adults support the young people, so that young people can feel a sense of belonging, agency, healthy identity as they move and navigate family, school, community settings. Now, power sharing and kind of scaffolding, grounding and scaffolding off young people's lived experience, we think has a lot of purchase in trying to cultivate social and emotional growth and development across these contexts. And so as we look at programs, the degree to which they share power with young people, give young people voice and choice, and also give families voice and choice, I think is an important characteristic, and the degree to which those programs speak to the local both strengths and challenges that diverse communities face, and help young people use their academic, social, and emotional skills to address those concerns. Those, we believe, have particular purchase in the current context, where we're wrestling as a society with issues of inequity and striving together to build a more healthy, robust, and equitable society.
Thank you, Rob. And I really appreciate you explaining how SEL relates to the quest for a more equitable society. But you said one thing that really piqued my interest, and that was that among the abilities that programs and the evolution of SEL are trying to help inculcate in kids is curiosity. And that speaks to something I've always wondered about, and that's that 2011 meta-analysis, which found an 11% jump in kids' academic achievement scores from SEL. And I always wondered why. Do you have a theory as to why SEL might help kids intellectually, cognitively, in terms of their test scores?
Well, I think, I think there are probably multiple reasons, right? Not the least of which is creating a context in which young people feel supported both by their peers and by teachers in the pursuit of academic concerns, right? And so I think that's fundamental to the positive impacts on academic, on outcomes. Now, curiosity, those kinds of environments can invite young people to become more curious, but especially in the degree to which the academic pursuit is understood relevant to the young people's lived experience. That's why the grounding and scaffolding of academic content based on local concerns and realities, I think, becomes important. I think that enhances engagement and subsequently leads to the kind of positive social and emotional growth and academic growth that we're interested in seeing for young people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let me ask Mark and Tish, do you have questions for Rob?
I don't have a question, but let me just add, I saw a teacher in 5th grade do a lesson before an achievement test. And what she did is she handed out 2 days beforehand a blank achievement test. And she had children look at the test and then talk out loud about all their thoughts. And children started to say things like, my mom says I'm no good at this, or I'm getting really nervous. And by giving them that chance to monitor their inner life, their inner thoughts about this, they learned how they could cope with the context of the test And in fact, the day of the test, she said it was one of the best days she'd ever had in a class where she'd had a test. And so this is an example of, in the moment, really helping kids to recognize what's going on in the inner self and learn to manage it more effectively. And I think that, as Rob said, there's many factors that influence academic achievement that are related to SEL, including the improvement in executive function skills and a sense of belonging in a classroom in which you feel cared for. But SEL can be applied directly to those situations in addition.
I was just going to build on that. I think especially content such as reading or any kind of content where you have to immerse yourself fully in the content to be successful. If you don't feel safe in the environment you're in, if there's any conflict around you, your attention is directed towards safety, not the content that you're focusing on. So the more kids feel safe in their environment, just like Mark said, the more able they are to engage in those kinds of processes. And just as a brief example of that, in the care research, which I'm going to talk about, we found that the kids with low social skills at baseline in our sample of 5,200 kids, those that had a teacher who had the care program, this adult SEL program I'm going to talk about, they improved in reading competence. And the way I explain that is, when they're able to focus because they feel safe, their teacher has improved their relationship with them and their peers, they're more able to dive into reading content. So that's how I would explain it.
Mm-hmm.
Rob, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. It absolutely does. And, this issue of what am I doing this for is one that I think all students, all young people wrestle with, right? Because it's an intergenerational process, the teaching and learning. And so the degree to which I'm helped to understand the relevance of it, predicated upon me understanding that I do belong and you do care and my peers care, and this information is relevant to furthering that, then allows young people to display their fullest talents, rather than them feeling disconnected from the academic content or from the people in that environment.
Well, quite well said. And I'd like to now turn to Tish and pick up on something you mentioned in passing, which is attention skills, focus. And Rob and Mark, you've made the point that when kids feel safe, when they feel secure, then their attention isn't divided. They can pay more attention, but they can pay fuller attention. Their focus is there to what the teacher's saying, to what they're learning. And Tish, one of the things you've done is to bring what's sometimes called mindfulness, I think of it as attention training actually, into schools to help kids with this. Could you tell us more about that whole movement to bring contemplative practice into schools, and also what is the CARE program?
So thanks. It's so great to be here with everybody. And first of all, I just give you a little bit of background about myself. As a meditator for many years, a contemplative practitioner, when I became a teacher, one of the first things I did was start to teach some simple practices to my students. And I'm talking early 80s, back before it was commonly employed in schools. And the reason I did that was because I saw that my students sometimes had a hard time coming down and paying attention. And I figured, well, I know this is one way to help them with that practice, with that ability to focus and pay attention. And then, years later, Congressman Ryan, our friend, said real clearly, we tell kids all the time, calm down and pay attention, but we never actually teach them how to do that. So there's really easy, simple ways to teach kids to calm down and pay attention. And I think this ability to focus your attention and to intentionally calm down are really critical underlying skills for the other SEL skills, especially self-awareness and self-management. When I'm able to focus my attention and calm down, I'm more able to notice how I'm feeling, how those feelings are associated with thoughts and the other things that are going on around me, my interaction with others. So in the programming that I've been working on, which most recently is the Compassionate Schools Project, which is a large study being conducted in Louisville, Kentucky of a contemplative SEL program. We teach kids something called calming and focusing. That's what we call it. We call it calming and focusing. It's pretty simple. The calming part, we invite them to feel, put a hand on their chest and on their belly and take some deep, slow, deep breaths so they can really sense and feel what is going on in their body, the feeling of the air going in and out. And as they do that practice, they find themselves calming down, and they can feel the difference between before and after calming practice. The focusing practice is really simple also. It's basically using something sensory to focus attention on. And in many cases, it's the sound of a bell, a chime, that kids can focus their hearing on and pay attention to that. So they're bringing attention to a sensory input. I think this is really important because one of the things we don't know a lot about in terms of these practices is the developmental trajectory of when kids can learn what practices. These that I'm describing are very simple and anyone can do at a pretty young age. I'd say, preschoolers can do these activities. And we don't know. So over time, we are going to learn more and more about how long of a duration kids can focus their attention and at what stage and age certain practices are appropriate. We still have a lot to learn, still have a lot to study. Other programs bring these same kinds of practices into them. We're not unique in offering these kinds of practices. I know several other curricula out there, social emotional learning, and that incorporate mindfulness and social emotional learning, do very, very similar practices. So that's what we've been working on with kids. And the other part of that, I think the other thing that I believe that the contemplative or the mindfulness and compassion practices bring to what we're doing is a value system. And Mark alluded to this to some degree. It answers this question: why should I care about others? Why is it that we want to do that? So the underlying value system in these contemplative practices is this understanding of a common humanity and respect for human dignity. And we experience that when we do these practices together. They provide this experience of interdependence and also this understanding that when someone is suffering, it affects all of us. So when another person is suffering, it's not isolated to that individual person, but it has an impact on all of us. And part of the compassion practices that we learn involve this intentional extension of compassion to others beyond our inner circle. So most of us don't have too much trouble extending compassion to those of us in our families and our close loved ones. But when we have to extend compassion out to people who are different than us, it's harder. And it takes practice, and it takes understanding that we are all human beings, even those that are different than us. So the Compassionate Schools Project that we developed, the program, the curriculum we developed, begins with this question: what is compassion? And how do I experience it? How do I receive it? How do I express it and share it? And why is it difficult sometimes? And how do I overcome the barriers to expressing compassion? And also, the overarching theme of that first lesson in that curriculum is that the value of compassion is intrinsically connected to the well-being of the community, and that by sharing compassion with one another, we are actually uplifting our community. And I think that's a really important dimension of all this. And this brings me to the final way in which I believe these mindfulness-based and practices and compassion practices can really make a big contribution to SEL, and that is in terms of the adult SEL. And years ago, when I first met Mark, actually, was right after the meeting in Dharamsala when some researchers, Paul Ekman, Margaret Kemeny, had started a project called Cultivating Emotional Balance at UC San Francisco. And they decided to create this program that combined the emotion skills and the mindful awareness practices for individuals to help manage emotions better in these contexts. And when they decided they were going to study this program with teachers, when I found out about this project, I had just graduated from UC Davis with my doctorate. I was living in the Bay Area, and I said, I want to do this. I want to work on this. So I got on the project, and that's how I met Mark. And at the time, we were both thinking about how important the adult's presence and warmth and calmness and clarity was to their ability to provide the support their students need. So since then, Mark and I wrote a paper that's now become sort of the mainstay in this field of adult SEL called the Pro-Social Classroom, where we really looked at what are these social emotional competencies that the adults need in the classroom. And one of the things we discovered, and I had already discovered this as a teacher and as a teacher educator, the classroom and the context of teaching and the environment that you're working in as a teacher is incredibly demanding, emotionally and cognitively. You have so many things going on simultaneously. You're all of you, the adult and the children, are in a room and cannot leave that room. You have to function in that kind of a context. Now, there's a lot going on in that environment, and often the things that are going on are not according to your plan. And you have to be able to go with that and maintain positive relationships with your students throughout. If you have a strong emotion while you're teaching, you have to find a way to regulate it that's not going to interfere with your teaching or your relationships with your students, which is not always easy. Because from my own experience, as you're teaching, your stress level can be going up in the background while you're trying to attend to all these details and not even realize that you're on the edge until something happens and, maybe you explode. Those kinds of things happen. And what these practices can do, which we found in our research, is that they can help you be more attuned to what's going on in your body so you can be proactive. As a teacher, you can notice, oh, I'm starting to get stressed. Oh, I can tell my shoulders are getting all tense, my jaw. Oh, I need to calm down. And then when they learn these practices, just like the calming and focusing we do with the kids, the adults can do that too and calm down, notice what's going on, and take some space, create a little bit of space. One of the major stressors teachers face is something called time urgency. You have these blocks of time that you're supposed to be delivering content in, and you're always worried that you're not going to get through with whatever it is that you're trying to do, which you often don't. And so there's always this time pressure. These practices help teachers just take some space from that and go and realize that the more they rush, the less efficacious they are. So calming down can not only help with the interactions with their students, but also the delivery of whatever it is that they're trying to teach. So what we've found is we created this, my colleagues and I, Mark and some other people, and our program is not alone. There are other programs out there similar to our program called CARE, which stands for Cultivating Awareness and Resilience in Education. It combines mindfulness, compassion, emotion skills, It's specifically designed for teachers to help teachers manage the stress in the classroom so they can be more present and aware and connected with their students. We've done several randomized trials of this program. And the most recent one was a large randomized trial in New York City with 224 teachers. And we also had 5,200 kids in our sample. And we randomly assigned the teachers to the two groups, a waitlist group or the care group. And we showed that care definitely improved the teachers' well-being. It reduced their distress, it improved their emotion regulation, it improved their mindfulness, and it reduced time urgency. But to me, what was really exciting is when we observed the classrooms and the interactions going on in these classrooms, we found that overall, the classrooms were more emotionally positive. And the way that played out was the teachers were more sensitive to the needs of their students, and the classrooms were more emotionally positive. So that was exciting. It had trickle-down effects into the actual context. Finally, we also showed impacts on students. Teacher reports of students showed that overall, the whole 5,200, half of the 5,200 were more engaged in learning, which also gives more support to what we were talking about earlier in terms of how these programs might improve academics. So right now we're doing a really interesting study, just briefly talk about, called Catalyze. And what we're doing, and this is going on in in Chicago, we are recruiting 40 schools. We're going to give all of them the PATHS curriculum that we were talking about earlier. Half of them will be randomly assigned to also get care. And we will see, does care improve the impacts that we know PATHS already has on the student outcomes, but we'll also be looking at the classrooms again too, to see if we're also improving these classroom interactions that I talked about earlier.
Tish, thank you so much for that. And I have a question for you before I open it up to Rob or Mark if they want to comment or question. And that is, you alluded to the fact that you teach some compassion practices. And you gave an example of the mindfulness practice. I'm interested in the compassion practices. How can you teach or help kids with compassion?
Well, one of the first ways that actually in the adult program and the program for children is to help the individual learn how to experience how to receive compassion. What does it feel like to receive compassion? Imagine a time when you felt loved. Imagine a time when somebody cared about you. How does that feel to think about that? This is something I learned from Cultivating Emotional Balance and Paul Ekman, is you can induce a feeling using a memory. And so in the care program, we often use memory as a way to help teachers explore the sensory experience of an emotion, a feeling, and then to generate it and savor it at the same time. So the first one is the receiving, because sometimes we find that can be challenging to receive that experience, but it also becomes then they develop a familiarity with it. And then you can imagine yourself extending that feeling that you received to somebody else. And sometimes you can do that through thinking about an individual and imagining that you hope that they feel good. Sometimes I see teachers, when their students are absent and they find out one of their students are sick, to ask the students in the class to imagine that their friend is well and feeling better, or how do you think your friend is feeling? How can we help them? So with young kids, you want to be really practical and concrete about these things. How can we help somebody? And also another part of compassion that's really important. Compassion has a lot of dimensions to it. One of them is awareness of suffering. So one of the first things that we have to do is recognize suffering and notice that that's what's happening. And that's another thing we can say. Somebody's crying. Why do you think they're crying? What's happening? Why is this? They're suffering. Why do you think they're suffering? And sometimes you can do that using stories or storybooks as a method of introducing this understanding of suffering. And then once you've recognized suffering, there's empathy. There's emotional empathy, feeling with the other person. How do you think that person feels? There's also the cognitive empathy. Why? Why are they feeling that way? And then there's the regulation of emotion, because with empathy can come distress. Like, so how do we cope with that distress of empathy? We shift it to feelings of warmth towards the other. Which we've seen in Tanya Singer's work. We shift from this distress of empathy to an open-hearted warmth that feels really good, as opposed to sometimes the empathetic distress can be overwhelming. And so these skills, they seem complicated, but they're actually really simple, and really young children can learn them.
Before I turn to Mark, I want to ask Rob a question. Tish mentioned the importance of teachers in this work and social emotional learning. Has any of your research touched on that, or is that part of your implementation best practices?
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's connectedness here. I think we have benefited from the work that Tish has described and that Mark collaborated with her on, in trying to begin to better articulate and to use as evaluative criteria in our program guide, for example. So the work that we review tends to be focused and in the service of young people developing these competencies, but increasingly, we all appreciate the fact that adults are essential to the modeling, to the context setting, and to the teaching and learning process that young people go through. And so the work that Tish describes is being woven increasingly into the way in which we think about programs. Like, what are the required implementation supports for educators to do a good job in cultivating and fostering social and emotional development of young people from diverse backgrounds?
So the programs in SEL, and I should mention, I think there are more than 100 now, many different programs, all, I hope, try to follow these best standards. And, for our audience, which will eventually be global, I also want to mention that many of these programs are translated into other languages, into Spanish, for example. And so they're available pretty much around the world, most European countries. Mark, I want to go over to you and ask, is there something you would like to add or ask?
Yeah, and in 2003, Roger Weisberg and I and others, formative in CASEL, wrote an American Psychologist paper. And in that paper, we basically said, that SEL programs are important, and they are. But there's a much bigger picture here that Rob has worked on, CASEL has worked on for the last 2 decades, which is to think about SEL as not a program, but as something much larger, which is systems change, which incorporates, of course, the adults. It incorporates disciplinary practices, the training of principals and leaders, restorative justice or other kinds of practices, connections to after-school programs, and as Rob said, to parents. And so while programs are very important and we know they make a difference, we're not going to make the kind of schools that we all yearn for just by putting in SEL programs. We need to think about the broader issues of how our teachers are trained, how our principals are trained, how we include parents into this process as part of what CASEL believes is important, which is true and deep systemic change.
I just like to build off that, Mark, because I feel, and also what Rob said, just like we want to give our students choice and voice, we need to give our teachers choice and voice, because a lot of times teachers are being put in very untenable situations where they're not they don't have control over their own classrooms because of mandated things coming from above. And they're being actually asked to do things that are contrary to what they know is the best for their students. And so as we look at shifting our school systems, I am very in support of empowering teachers and giving teachers way more choice and voice about how they teach and when and how they introduce these kinds of practices into their classrooms.
I've heard that one of the groups that likes SEL the most is teachers, because kids focus and they're calmer, you don't have to spend so much time quieting them down. Is that true? Well,
I think SEL gives voice to the reason most teachers become teachers. They want to see children thrive. And, I think once you've been teaching for a while, when I first started teaching, I was very focused on academics. But over time, I realized it was really the community I was building that was most valuable to me and the most enjoyable part of teaching. And I think SEL gives voice to that. It says, this is important. Creating these communities, creating a community where everybody feels valuable and everybody feels like they're part of this community. That is what gives meaning to life and to joy to teaching.
So Rob, question for you. Given that there are such long-term impacts from SEL, and also, as Mark has said, one of the implicit goals is a more equitable society, a systems change. Do you see those two dots connecting somehow?
I think there's potential that I think we need to work towards. Education more generally and all of the other enterprises or institutions that we all operate in have to be brought into a measure of harmony in order to bring about the kind of change that I think we're all alluding to here. It's because you have inequity or disparities in so many areas of human functioning. It's certainly education is pivotal to helping us become more humane, more just in our interpersonal relationships as well as our institutional relationships. But it's not just education, it's the manifestation of what it is we learn and together that then has to play itself out in all of these interpersonal and institutional settings.
I remember going to a school in Spanish Harlem. It's a school that had a program developed by another co-founder of CASEL, a woman named Linda Lantieri. And I was told that it was a class of 7-year-olds. I was told half the kids in this classroom have what are called special needs, like hyperactivity being one. And I thought that the class would be very chaotic, but it was actually quite calm and pretty focused. And I asked the teacher, why is that? And she said, watch this. And then they started a program they called Billy Buddies, where each kid, one by one, went and got their special stuffed animal, found a place to lie down on a rug and put the animal on their belly and watched it rise on the in-breath and fall on the out-breath. Rise on the in-breath and fall on the out-breath. And it seemed to me that this kind of proto-mindfulness, if you will, it was a kind of a training of the ability to ignore distractions and focus, because if your mind wandered off, you bring it back to the animal, to your breathing. And from my point of view, it seemed to be a way to strengthen what's technically called cognitive control, the ability to focus on one thing and ignore other things, which in terms of neuroscience uses pretty much the same strip of executive center, the prefrontal cortex. And I was struck by findings in a study in New Zealand that followed kids from ages 4 to 8, where they assessed cognitive control, into their 30s. And they found that it predicted a child's health, a child's financial success, even whether or not they went to prison over the course of their life, much better than did the child's IQ or the wealth of the family they grew up in. I thought, wow, this seems to level the playing field in an interesting way. And I wonder if any of you see that as one of the potentials of SEL.
Well, I do, Dan, and let me take this a little bit further in terms of where we're going or where I hope the future is going. And that
Sure.
is around health and long-term health. And
Mhm.
actually, CASEL began after a series of meetings about mind-body psychology that Elaine Growald and others started and then evolved into CASEL. And there is now some data, for example, on adult programs like Tish has talked about, showing improvements in systolic and diastolic blood pressure and awakening morning cortisol response in teachers. And Kim Schonert-Reichelt and Eva Oberle have shown that teachers who are depressed or burned out have children who have higher circulating cortisol in their classrooms. And yet we haven't thought yet very much about physiological health as a both short-term and long-term outcome of these programs.
Mark, can I stop you? Can you explain why cortisol is important?
Yeah, cortisol is important in two different ways. And the waking morning cortisol is the energy we need basically at the beginning of the day. But also circulating cortisol during the day is a really measure of how stressed children are. And children who are in classrooms with teachers who are burned out have higher circulating levels of that. So I'm hoping that one place we go further is not just focusing on attention or emotion regulation, but how this relates to the development of chronic diseases like heart disease and diabetes and asthma. Because I believe that these SEL programs, when they're well done, help children to settle in a way that not only helps them to pay attention and regulate their emotions, but it's having deeper physiological impacts. And this is an area we don't know much about yet.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that because these issues also relate to trauma. When people are exposed to trauma, it disrupts some of these systems because the threat system is hyper alert, and so it becomes hard to learn when you're trying to recover from trauma. It's hard to function. And the support of a community is really critical for healing trauma. Now, in the midst of this pandemic, we're all experiencing some degree of trauma right now. And for us to recover from that, especially in the schools, we're going to really need to build this strong community so it can help buffer the effects of trauma, and we can calm ourselves and feel safe in our school environments and our homes and our communities too.
Rob, were you about to add something? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that, Tish's point is well taken. We all, I think on this panel, think in terms of psychological constructs, et cetera. This, but part of what we have to do is to connect the psychological with the structural. In the absence of doing that, I think you end up reproducing the inequities, but potentially making people better able to cope with it, which I think is short-sighted in terms of the potential that SEL and other such innovations actually offer. These things are constructed by humans, and so we can construct better institutions and systems that are much more humane and fertile for optimal growth and development of human beings.
Rob, that's a wonderful note for us to end the panel on. I want to thank you, Rob Jagers from CASEL, Tish Jennings, University of Virginia, and Mark Greenberg, who is very active, but supposedly retired. It's been wonderful. Thank you again on the behalf of Mind and Life Institute.
Thank you.